Bisi held the pregnancy test with shaking hands. 2 red lines stared back at her. She smiled. But it wasn't joy. "No one will ever know," she whispered. "This baby came from my own son." Bisi was a quiet woman in her late 40s. She lived in a small town in Nigeria, where people talked a lot and judged even more. She was married to Chuka, a proud man who believed that children were the most important gift from God. They already had 1 child, a son named Kelechi, but Chuka wanted more. He wanted another boy, someone to carry his name, someone strong. Every week, Chuka reminded Bisi that her body was getting old. He would say things like, "Look at the neighbors. Even younger wives are giving birth. What is wrong with you?" Bisi stayed silent, but inside she was breaking. She had been to the doctor alone. She had taken every test. The results said she was healthy. There was nothing wrong with her womb. But when she asked the doctor if Chuka should get tested, the woman lowered her voice and said, "It's not allowed here. He will never accept it. He will blame you." So Bisi kept the secret. She cried at night when no one was looking. She watched as Chuka praised Kelechi for being strong, smart, and tall. And then she had a thought, one that scared her. If Chuka can't give me a child, maybe Kelechi can. She quickly shook her head. No, that was madness, a sin, a curse. But the idea didn't leave her, not when she was cooking, not when she was praying, not even when she smiled at her husband. The thought stayed, and day by day, it grew stronger. One evening, Kelechi came home from university. He was tall now, with broad shoulders and a deep voice. He looked like a full man, no longer a boy. When he entered the house, Chuka's eyes lit up. "Look at you," he laughed, grabbing Kelechi's shoulders. "You're a lion now. You'll make a strong father one day." Bisi smiled gently, but her chest tightened. Chuka always said those words. "You'll make a strong father." She had heard them again and again. But not to her. At night, while cleaning the kitchen, she heard Chuka speaking on the phone. "She's old now," he said, laughing softly. "If she doesn't give me another son this year, I may need to take a second wife." That plate in her hand slipped and broke. She knelt to pick up the pieces. Her fingers were bleeding, but she didn't feel the pain. She sat alone later, staring at the candle flame. Her mind went back to her wedding day, Chuka smiling, her mother warning her. He is proud. If he ever feels shamed, he will not forgive. Bisi was once strong, but now she was scared. The next morning, Kelechi woke up with a fever. His body was weak. His forehead was hot. Bisi stayed close to him, giving him herbs and wiping his skin. He was half awake, too tired to speak clearly. "Mama," he mumbled. "I feel cold." "Shh, my son. Just rest. Let Mama take care of you." As she cleaned, the sweat from his chest, her eyes fell on him. Strong, youthful, full of life. The thought returned. The terrible thought. The one she had tried to kill before. If his father can't give me a child, maybe the child can. She stood up quickly, heart pounding. No, God forbid, this is madness. But the thought didn't leave. It stayed in her dreams, in her prayers, in the silence between words. She began researching in secret. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, she searched her phone. Artificial insemination, home method, closest, DNA match. One site explained it clearly. Using a biological relative as a donor is risky, but DNA compatibility is high. In closed cultures, it has been used to preserve bloodlines. Her hand trembled. She dropped the phone, but she picked it up again. No touch, no sex, just collection, just science. That's how she told herself it was okay. Days passed. Kelechi was getting better. She waited. She planned. She washed a towel he used and hung it carefully. When he left the room, she entered quickly. She found another cloth, still damp from sweat, and carried it in silence to the kitchen. She pulled out a clean bowl, gloves, and the small plastic syringe she had hidden since Kelechi's birth. Just like before, she whispered. Same. Hands. Same pain. Different reason. She locked the bathroom door. She was calm. Too calm. She placed the sample into the syringe. She sat on the edge of the tub. She closed her eyes. And she did it. No crying. No sound. Just silence. When she was done, she looked at her face in the mirror. She looked the same. But she was not the same woman anymore. God, she whispered, you were watching. But I'm still your daughter. Please don't curse me. She walked out slowly. Kelechi was asleep again. Chuka was outside. And inside her, the lie had begun to grow. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Bisi kept quiet, but her heart wasn't still. She woke up feeling sick. Her body felt heavy. Food didn't taste the same. Her breasts were sore. She knew the signs, but she said nothing. She didn't want to hope. She didn't want to believe it had worked. She was afraid. Afraid of God. Afraid of the ancestors. Afraid of her own reflection. One morning, while washing clothes outside, she felt dizzy. She dropped the cloth and leaned on the basin. Chuka was watching from the porch. Are you all right? He asked. She nodded, forcing a smile. It's the sun. Nothing more. That night, she took the test. She locked the door and knelt on the floor with shaking hands. She had done this before, many times. Always one line, always empty. But this time, there were 2 red lines. Her heart raced. She couldn't breathe. She didn't cry. Not yet. She sat there staring at the small plastic stick, as if it would change its mind. Pregnant, it said. You did it. The next day, she sat under the mango tree in the yard. Chuka joined her. She looked up at him and whispered, I have something to tell you. His eyes widened. He leaned closer. I'm pregnant. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he laughed. He shouted. He jumped to his feet. God, you have remembered me. My wife, my queen. You have done it. He called his brother. He called his pastor. He called the tailor to sew a new outfit. Bisi just sat there, smiling, but not breathing. That night, she had a dream. She was standing in a room full of mirrors. Every mirror showed a different version of her. One smiling, one crying, one covered in blood. Then she saw Kelechi. He was holding the baby. He looked at her and asked, Why did you take this from me? She woke up gasping, her hands shaking. The weeks passed. Her belly grew. The village women came to rub her stomach and sing songs. You will bring a strong son, they said. This one is a king. But when they left, she sat by the window and watched the moon. She would whisper to the baby, You are loved, even if you were born in silence. Sometimes Kelechi walked by her door and heard her. He frowned but said nothing. One afternoon at the market, she overheard 2 women talking. Did you hear? Bisi is pregnant again. At her age? Maybe it's a miracle. Or maybe it's something else. Bisi turned away before they could see her face. The whispers had started. The shadows were growing. Kelechi was trying to focus on his online schoolwork, but something felt off in the house. His mom smiled too much now, but her eyes didn't match her smile. She talked to herself when she thought no one was listening. Sometimes she walked into his room without knocking and just stood there, quiet. One day, he found her sitting in the living room with her hands on her stomach. She was whispering something softly. He stood in the doorway and asked, "Mama, are you okay?" She jumped a little and quickly smiled. "Yes, my son. I'm just talking to the baby." Kelechi nodded, but something in his chest felt tight. Later, that week, while cleaning the house, he found an old bag under her bed. It had a used syringe, a wrapped towel, and some printed pages. He pulled the papers out. The title said, "How to Get Pregnant Without a Man Knowing, Home Method." Kelechi froze. He kept reading. The steps, the method, the tools. It all looked too real, too strange. His head started spinning. Why did his mom have this? He wanted to ignore it, but he couldn't. That evening, he asked carefully, "Mama, you and Papa, were you trying to have a baby again?" She turned slowly and said, "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," he replied. "Because Papa told me before that he didn't want more kids." Bisi looked away. "God has his own plans," she said. But Kelechi couldn't sleep that night. He remembered his fever weeks ago, how she stayed close, how she touched his forehead, how she told him to rest and let Mama take care of you. His eyes widened in the dark. His heart pounded. No, it can't be. The next morning, he walked past her room and heard her again. "You'll grow strong, just like your real father. And he'll never know." Kelechi stepped back. He stood there, frozen. He wanted to scream. He wanted to cry. But all he could do was whisper to himself, "Mama, what did you do?" The day came. Bisi went into labor early in the morning. Chuka rushed her to the clinic down the road. He was so proud. "A strong child will come today," he said. "Another boy. I can feel it." Kelechi stayed at home, sitting on the floor of his room, holding the papers he had found. His heart was heavy. His stomach hurt. He didn't want to believe what he knew. But something deep inside told him it was true. By afternoon, the baby was born. A boy, healthy, loud, strong. Chuka danced around the compound. He called his friends. "God has answered my prayers. My name will live forever." But when Kelechi saw the baby, his whole body went cold. The baby looked like him. Same nose, same eyebrows, same little mole above the lip. He stepped back. No, this is not possible. Later that night, Bisi was resting on her bed, holding the baby. Kelechi walked in. His face was pale, his eyes full of tears. He stood at the door and whispered, "Why did you do this?" Bisi looked up slowly. Her lips trembled, her eyes filled with fear. She didn't lie. She didn't pretend. She just said, "I was going to lose everything. Your father. This home. My name." Kelechi stepped closer. His voice cracked. "You took it from me. You took my blood. You used me." Bisi cried harder. "I didn't touch you. I didn't hurt you. I just used what I needed. I had no choice." Kelechi shouted, "That's still a choice." He slammed his fist on the wall. The baby started crying. Bisi held the child close and whispered, "Please, don't tell him. Your father must never know." Kelechi turned away, tears falling down his face. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said. "Brother? Father? Victim?" He walked out of the room, and the house felt colder than ever. The next morning, the house was full of people. Friends and neighbors came to see the baby. Chuka stood in the center, smiling from ear to ear. He held the baby up and said loudly, This is my son, the answer to my prayers." Everyone clapped. They shouted and danced. They sang songs and called Bisi a strong woman. But inside her heart, she felt nothing but fear. Kelechi stood in the back corner. His hands were in his pockets. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He just watched. The baby was wearing a white cloth with golden beads. Chuka kissed the boy's forehead and said, "He looks like me, doesn't he?" Everyone nodded, but Kelechi looked at the baby's eyes. They were his. Later that day, Chuka came to Kelechi and said, "You must be happy, my son. You have a little brother now." Kelechi forced a smile. "Yes, Papa, I'm happy," but his hands were shaking. That night, Kelechi sat alone outside the house. The sky was dark. The stars were quiet. He stared at the full moon and whispered, "To himself, I am his father. But no one knows. Not even him." Behind him, Bisi walked out, holding the baby. She sat beside him. Her face was tired, her eyes red. She didn't speak for a while. Then she said softly, "I know you hate me, but I kept this family together." Kelechi turned his face. "You broke me to protect your name." Bisi looked down. The baby was asleep in her arms. "Please," she whispered, "just let your father be happy. That's all I ask." Kelechi stood up and walked away. He didn't answer her. And Chuka? He never asked questions. He never doubted anything. He raised the baby with love, never knowing the truth. Years passed. The boy grew fast. He had his father's strength, but his brother's face. Kelechi never said a word, not to Chuka, not to anyone. But every time the boy called him brother, his chest burned. One evening, the boy ran to him with a smile and shouted, "Uncle, guess what? Mama said I look just like you." Kelechi froze. He forced a laugh. He rubbed the boy's head. But when the child ran off, he whispered under his breath, "You don't just look like me. You came from me." That night, he stood at the edge of the village, staring into the wind, and for the first time, he spoke to the sky. One day, he will find out, and when he does, this house will burn. What do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments section.